limited, 100 applications for one job. So a friend of mine and I thought, well, we do PA as a minor, because that makes us eligible. So, among other things, management-wise, I applied at Heineken beer breweries, didn't get a job, but in four months' time after I graduated, I got a week after I graduated, a question whether I wanted to come in the PA section of the political science department at the University of Leiden in 1983 as the research assistant to a professor. And I was humming along there for a year, and after a year he said, Jos, you want to do this for your PhD? So that's my first book. Now, having said that, and after 2 years or so of archival work in development of local government in the Netherlands, in terms of personnel, size and composition, 400 years. And I had written by that time already 450 single-spaced pages of research notes. Professor van Graan comes into my office with a big box, and I was in the attic of the law building with a big box, and he says, Jos, I think it's time that you start doing some theory. Because historians, they know everything about archives. I can read written texts from the 15th century and up without a problem, right? But when it comes to quantitative statistical methods, I'm an absolute nincompoop. And the theory that he wanted me to read about is not quantitative statistical methods, but it was about conceptual frameworks with which would help me understand what I had seen in the archives over time in terms of development of local government personnel. So I get into this PA literature big time, way beyond what I had to do in the minor, which was about a full year of study, 1,800 hours. That's how it's counted in the Netherlands. Now, and as I do that, and in the course of the late 80s and the 90s, I start getting a little irritated with the fact, because I really liked PA, because it gave me something with which I could look at the world beyond the events, the big people names, and whatever else it is that you do in history. When people think about history and how they had it in high school, they think it's boring. Well, it's not. But it is made interesting when you provide a conceptual framework with which you can probe into the past, a specific searchlight, a heuristic, if you will. And it gave me a heuristic to understand social science, PA, heuristic with which I could understand the past better. And it still keeps me going this day. Now,
you're already off the script.
Huh?
You're already off the script.
I know. No, I want to give this background because I started irritating with this notion of identity crisis. In PA.
No, we're here for one reason.
I'm not getting here. I'm not getting here.
Wait, we're here for one reason.
I know.
Yost mad that Herbert Simon called PA an intellectual backwater. That's the real reason we're here. Okay?
He wrote it in his autobiography, 1991, where I advise everyone to read, I believe, chapter 16, on how his wife and his other object, so to speak, person, helped him overcome an infatuation with a doctoral student by the use of the concept of bounded rationale. Now, academic backwater, and I got irritated. Academic backwater, look at what all these people are doing.
He's still mad.
So, it's not an academic backwater, and it is something that has driving me writing about the nature of the study of public administration. And one of those things that I did in this book, that I found to help me map where PA is, this is the field of academic disciplines and studies that Henry Small put together and published in 1996. And at some point, Karen and I started talking about that thing, and she said, oh my gosh, I know a whole lot of stuff about this, about bibliometric analyses, etc. Now, is PA an academic backwater? Rosenblum believes that PA is something of an interdisciplinary study, and in the article we explain how we look at that, that draws upon especially public management, political science, and law. We think that PA has developed in a way that is very different from how the academy was defined by or in German universities in the 19th century, which is that a field of study is identified by clear epistemological boundaries. Yeah? So physicians determine the content and quality of research in physics, not theologians. with an interdisciplinary study, and that is certainly the case for all professional studies, clear boundaries are just impossible. They are very different, but we are still assessed by this notion of very narrow disciplinary boundaries. We don't have that. As a consequence, we don't have a paradigm. Now, I know the word paradigm is often used in terms of framework, but a paradigm is really a set of theories and concepts, interrelated, that describe and explain and predict. Now, I don't know what you think in the study of public affairs, public administration. We cannot predict. I mean, I certainly could not have predicted the situation in the United States and a variety of other Western democracies find themselves in today. Think tanks, and Caroline and I were talking about that this morning, think tanks in the area of public affairs have been emerging since the 1920s and the 1930s. But their focus is what Novotny called mode 2 thinking. And mode 2 thinking is applied work. Well, one of the things that PA was criticized for, and I didn't understand it in the late 80s and 90s, is that it lacks that theoretical framework that Simon had in the back of his mind when he called it an academic backwater, because Simon thinks theoretical, conceptual. He doesn't think about applied, because applied is for, outside the university. So universities have much more focus on theory and conceptual development, right? So in that sense, I think PA does both. And now I see for the camera.
Well, I'm not going to. No, I'll get up when I'll wave my hands when I. So my background is philosophy. So I come out of philosophy, very interested in epistemological development, which is how I came to study part of what we're looking at today. But one of the things that I've spent quite a bit of time on is doing knowledge maps, right? And where do new fields emerge, and how do they emerge? So if we looked historically at fields of study, right? Originally, in the 17th century, there was really only two kinds of studies. That is medicine, or three: medicine, mathematics, and what was called experimental philosophy, right? And out of those three fields, now we have, 240 fields, I think, that National Science Foundation lists as fields. So why did we do this study? Partly because of Herbert Simon, who made us very mad, and called our field a backwater. So the question is it still a backwater? Is it a field in itself? If it is a field, why is it a field, and what makes it a field? And then what is its relationship to other fields? So why study this, and how did I come to study it? The National Science Foundation is very interested in interdisciplinary research. I'm sure you've all heard that lots and lots of different times. So is NIH and so on. To the extent that those agencies still exist, they're still interested in interdisciplinarity. Why? Anybody? Any ideas? Why is interdisciplinarity so interesting to funders?
There's gaps.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's gaps between the disciplinary boundaries.
Good. There's gaps that need to be could be filled in theory.
Also, really important big discoveries are usually made on these margins.
Right. Exactly. So a lot of really new, novel things come out, and you're right. The gaps indicate something that could be bridged in theory, and how to get that to happen, and happen, at least from the National Science Foundation on purposes, get it to happen faster. So many years ago now, I led a study for NSF on how to measure and understand and define interdisciplinarity, and out of that came a lot of work on knowledge mapping and what fields are related to what fields. So we decided to do that with public administration and see, when did public administration become a field? And as a field, then, is it very isolated and just speaks within itself, which has also been a criticism of PA, that it only speaks to itself, or does it relate to other disciplines as well? So what we wanted to do then is say, how does public affairs emerge in the academy, right? So as Joost said, one of the things we see is there's a lot of, especially at the beginning of public administration, a lot of the work was being done more at the practical side, the practical end of things, right? But in order to become an academic discipline, right, you have to have certain features. What are some of the features of academic disciplines that are different from practical? Anybody? Doctoral students? Anybody? What would make an academic field academic as opposed to practical?
Valid. Has a Nobel Prize.
There you go. Herbert Simon has one. Yeah, David.
Research questions?
Yeah, research questions, theories, right? Theories by which you then develop, more of a quote-unquote scientific method, right? We make an observation, you make your best guess, you develop experimentation, you analyze, right? That's how we do academic research. They don't do that at Rand, where I used to work. They don't analyze things in that way, right? That's much more of an academic style of research. In order to stand up in the academy, right, as we've seen this college develop over time, right? It started off as an area of study, then an institute, then then a school, then a college, and so on. Now we're an independent college within a university.
Yeah.
So, and that is an emergence of a field, let's say, just as biochemistry emerged from a combining of chemistry and biology in around the 1920s, 1930s. It wasn't a field until you saw people coming together right across that map of scientific knowledge. And so let's look at a couple of maps together. I love mapping, and so I'm going to show you a couple of maps here. Any ideas?
Sophia, do you know if the clicker's working?
Is it not working?
Yeah, that's true,
Okay, all right, let me just do a little mapping. If anybody wants to sit down and learn mapping, I'm happy to do it. Yost is going to point out public administration review right there in the middle. This is a 10-year map of the cross-linkages between over 10 years and the social science citation index from the Web of Science. Okay, so what this shows is these are journals citing other journals. Okay, so when you're publishing in public administration review, you may cite, maybe if you're working on something in psychiatry or child psychiatry, you may cite a journal over here. And that will make one link between your prior journal and a journal over here. Okay, and it's an indication of interdisciplinarity. Okay, in other words, you're drawing from another discipline in order to enrich your own thinking. And so what this shows, and what I think is so cool about mapping, is that indeed, once you put all these journals and maps together, they actually cluster into academic fields, right? And so here you see over here, social sciences, social science quarterly there. The size of the node is related to the number of references to that journal. You can see environment, management, science. So over here we have management and economics, banking. Over here we have more youth services, family studies, autism. Up on the top, psychology, and over here, business. And then you can see where PAR is up here, right in the middle. And that's where you can see, interestingly, kind of in the middle of the cluster is public affairs there. And so what you see is that what we did, this is just a 10-year mapping, but what we did is then look at that and take it apart to see like what has happened to the field over time. So let's flip to the next one. All right. So you can stop this at any point in time and look at that year. And what we provided here is all of the journals related that are somehow cited by public affairs journals to one another and this is all the years they were formed. And you can see that what has happened is a very slow start, right, from 1906. But in the 1970s, 1980s, you see a real explosion of numbers of journals. And in 1990s, you'll see, if you read the titles, a lot of foreign journals join the mix. So it's a really, really interesting progression of the field over time. And what we saw, we just looked at 2008. Okay, we took 2008 as a starting point. Now, what this shows you is just the field of public administration, right? So now we take that big, big map and we like zoom on in to just the public administration journals. And here you see Public Administration Review, which you all know is the journal that is edited by our esteemed colleague, Raadschelders. This is my journal, Science and Public Policy. I edited that journal for 10 years. And so what you see in this map in 2008, here's public affairs, and you can see it's very closely related to the political sciences over here. There's a lot of cross-referencing going on there. There's some to here, academic management, a little bit here. A loose connection to economic studies, and a very loose connection to my field, right, research policy, science policy, okay? So you can see that they're connected, and then over here you see an emerging area of climate science, okay? So that's the measures of connection in 2008. Can you flip, Cynthia, to the next one? This is the same mapping, but in 2018. So what do you see that's different in this mapping from the earlier map? Comments?
Energy economics.
Energy and economics really explodes, right? The other thing I noticed as a mapper is that there's so much more density among these subfields, right? And they're closer, right? And the other one you saw, they were farther away, right? In a way, the farther away means that the journal on the outside is being drawn away to something that's off the screen, see? But here, the field becomes much more concentrated, much more connected, and you can see the actual place on the map we were not going to pay attention to right now, but you could see public administration is very closely more connected, actually, to political science, to research policy, to American Economic Review, sort of moves out a little bit, technology transfer, research policy. And science, my little journal moves closer over to public policy.
Not yet, I will today.
So this is another map. So could you flip to the? Okay, now we took the 2018 and we looked at all the cross-sighting patterns and said, okay, let's see how it relates back to, we're coming out now. We went deep into the field. Now we're coming out a little bit. And here you can see the connections between public administration, political science. So this now creates a cluster. You see Science Magazine, Global Environmental Change. This is all now a cluster of fields. And so you can really see the influence of other fields that are now becoming very much more closely connected to public administration and still retaining connections to research policy, economics, and energy policy. All right, I think that might be all the visuals. Do we have another one? Oh, okay, I just did this one. Took me a while, but I just asked who cites PA journals in 2024. Okay, this is a slightly different measure because what I did was ask the machine, tell me, and luckily this takes a long time to make a map like this, but with AI, we're going to be able to make maps like this very quickly over time. Right now, it's hard. Like this probably took me 25 hours to make this map, but soon we'll be able to map much faster. And so here, what you can see is I said is like, show me everybody who references public administration, okay? Not going out, but coming in, who is actually referencing the field. And so what we tried to show, and I think we show in the article, is that over time, what you see is public administration moves to become indeed more isolated and more contained, okay? In part because it's developing its own identity as a field, and in that process becomes less connected to other fields. But what has happened over time is that past the 70s and 80s into the 2000s, we see public affairs becoming more interdisciplinary over time. So in becoming more integrated with other fields. And so all of this mapping is showing you the journals that are citing public administration. So now we see economics, right, and management, research policy. These are all now citing public affairs at a much greater rate than they did even 20 years ago, right, when we saw the field was somewhat self-contained. But really what you see is this happens in almost all fields of inquiry as they develop, right? First, you emerge out of other fields, sociology, political science, economics, you emerge out of that. In order to develop your own identity, you kind of close off a little bit and develop your own language, your own theories, your own concepts and frameworks, right? And you're citing yourself. Once you've developed that identity, right, now you can re-emerge as an interdisciplinary and a resource to other fields. As you can see here, we see a lot of other fields that are now citing public administration. Yeah.
I'm wondering if it's, I don't know the technique, so is it possible to explore how they're citing? Because I could imagine an econ journal citing a PA journal for context, as opposed to theory, right? And so I don't know if that's where you go, or if that's
Not in
feasible
this
to look
case.
at.
No, this is just a connection.
Right.
So it doesn't indicate what is being cited. That can easily be done, and people do it all the time to try to see, like, what knowledge are they taking or giving, what's actually exchanged. Because you have to assume, so this is the other thing, in theory, there's theory behind this, right? So there's quite a lot of theory, and we can't go into it now, but the theory is that there's reciprocity at some level. Even if one reference references something else, they don't necessarily, that one reference is called directed, like I do it to you kind of thing. But over time, you would expect to see a reciprocity develop. And that's what we're looking at here, is that fields over time begin to converse, and there's a communication between them. It's not just a one-way connection.
And that's that mutual recognition of theory, but it's not for content.
It could be theory or content. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Yeah, Dave?
So the size of the circle indicates how often that cites in this picture public administration review. What do the lengths indicate? Are they a quantitative measure of anything?
Yes.
Between the centrales.
Yeah, okay, so in the theory of network theory, right, for example, PAR and American Economic Review are what's called highly between other fields, okay? So in other words, it's a very powerful journal in that sense. And what you see over time is that these powerful journals, and I'll see if Yost agrees with me, the powerful journals retain a field. They don't take novel work. They don't take things that challenge the field very much. They tend to retain the knowledge of a field and hold on to kind of a core canon, let's say. And so if you were looking for new ideas or novel thought, you're going to look on the outside of the field, right? And so what happens is in any complex system, right, the novel things will happen on the outside. 90% of them die off, but 10% are really, really important. Okay, and so that's how the system develops as a knowledge system, right? The knowledge system wants novelty, but the novelty isn't going to occur here or here. Okay, Yost?
I agree with what Caroline said, and I don't remember the two co-authors' names who checked 40 or 50 years of publications in economics and interviewed Nobel Prize winners in economics. What happened with the piece or pieces that they got the Nobel Prize for 30, 40 years down the road? In most cases, they were rejected by the top journals.
In this case, our journal article was rejected by PAR.
That was before me. Right. And I wouldn't publish in it, so myself.
Yeah. So, because I think the same thing, when we got our reviews back, they're like, what is this? You know, what does this mean? This doesn't make any sense. This isn't public administration, whatever. So we're,
And we had a question from one of the reviewers for ARPA, where we finally, because initially we sent it to Scientometrics, and to Minerva,
We sent it to Minerva.
Minerva.
Yeah.
And one of the reviewers asked, why is this important? Why do we do this? Well, that's where a historical perspective comes in real handy. Because in the article we mentioned how in the 17th and 18th century people start thinking about the position and role of government in a way that they never had before. By the way, that'll be the topic of my next book that I'm starting this semester. For millennia, people only thought about the relation between those who govern and the governed. They didn't think about the position and role of government in society. That emerges in the early 17th century. First handbook PA is the mid-17th century, 1665, by Ludwig von Seckendorf. And he writes about a variety of policy areas that governments should pick up, stuff that governments never had done, beyond military, police, justice, and a little bit of taxation. Yes, they did some irrigation, I know, but you couldn't really call it policy making. Yeah? But they start writing about the role and position of government in society from the 17th century on. Now, what you see with the emergence of PA in the late 19th century, let's call it the modern study of PA. I'm going to get away from the slide here. Modern study of PA is initially focused on skills, immediate skills that people need if they want to have a successful career in government. And I have seen back in the Netherlands, and my friend and colleague Richard Stillman did so for the United States, that the call for give me applied, relevant knowledge, develop usable knowledge that I can immediately teach and get people ready for a workforce in a local government that faces demands that are way beyond what local governments were addressing until then. That is, as a consequence of urbanization, housing and zoning, transportation, sewage, electricity, gas. And these PA programs were developed to a large extent on both sides of the Atlantic by practitioners. That is what you call city managers, or in Europe are called municipal secretaries. And that focus on administrative skills and techniques lasts well into the 20th century. So what we describe in here as the modern study of PA, and what I've learned from Caroline, we had, by the way, we started with this article in 2019.
Yeah.
We had a lot of fun, because it's also a discovery of how the other thinks. You know, where the heck is she coming from? You know, so I had to learn a lot of technical stuff, but that it was at first interdisciplinary in terms of where can I draw information from that will help me, city manager, address what my folks want or what the city council asked me to do. Yeah? So it is very applied in focus.
Yes.
And PA starts to turn more theoretical and conceptual in the course of the 1970s. And then you see, and that's how I finally came to understand Jim Perry and a variety of those other folks that are cited in the article who complained in the 80s about what? That PA has, where is it, lack of theory, low theoretical quality, that we borrow from other studies and discipline but don't give anything back, and that we're disconnected from other fields. So what I started irritated about, it's now gone, I'm no longer irritated, I'm totally happy.
Hear that, Simon?
I see him. Well, I would love to talk with Simon, because Simon knew, like anybody, that things evolve, right? So, and Simon operates from what I call a narrow conception of science. And that is the way that science is defined in Western countries since the late 18th century as a body of knowledge developed by a set of specific methods, instead of the older meaning of science, which is still used that way in the Francophone languages, say the Mediterranean and France, right? As a body of organized knowledge, nothing more, nothing less. If you define science that way, which is something that I do in my 11th book, if you define science that way, then all of a sudden, all sorts of fields of knowledge are becoming important. And what we find is that PA has gone through that phase of turning inward and recognizing that if we want to cater to that science element of our study, after having paid a lot of attention to the applied side since the late 19th century, then you need to, and that has happened. Because, and that is not a slide that we have up there, I couldn't load that up because it's unreadable pretty much in the article too, but if you take a magnifier, and I've done that so I can read this, This is the fields that cite public administration review in the past 4 decades. You can see it in the article. This is 2000, what is it, Caroline? 1980. 1980 to 2020. So I don't know what happens in 2003. I've been raking my brain over this. But here, public administration review gets to be referenced by a whole boatload of studies, journals. Yeah. And yeah, if you look at the sideline here, women's studies, water resources, veterinary sciences, of all places. Urban studies, food policy stuff is in there. Whole lot of studies. So we argue that PA has returned back to its interdisciplinary nature, but now with this ability to develop theories and conceptualizations that are relevant to other studies. We have faculty who do interdisciplinary stuff. I was thinking of Russell. Stuff that you do is relevant not just to PA, but has turned out to be relevant in a variety of other fields, criminal justice, psychology, or behavior, and that goes for a variety of folks. Neil's stuff, Jill's, your stuff, Stephanie. So that is how we have summarized the development of, call it a practitioner-oriented study that will always need to balance applied with theory, academe with practice. And there is no way we get out of that. So I have no physics envy. I have no problem with that people think we're not good enough because we're not up to snuff in comparison to physics, chemistry, and mathematics. Well, that's correct. We are extremely different. And even Auguste Comte in the early 19th century recognized that the most difficult studies are those that deal with objects, like public administration and society, that address issues that are continuously in flux. We do not deal with universal laws, gravity, magnetism, take a pick. We deal with something that is fluid, and how we see and describe the world today will be different 10 years from now, Lord knows. When I was 20, the world was defined very different as in comparison to the way it is now. Now let me see.
Let's
Go
let
ahead.
people ask questions. Give comments. All right. Comments, questions, thoughts? Yes,
I have a
Stephanie.
question about this map. So, is this, which PA journals are included? Is it
Okay,
just
so
our,
at
like
the very,
paper?
very beginning of
Yeah.
the study,
Yeah.
right, and this
Yeah.
also blew Leos's mind a little bit, I used a statistical measure to assess which journals are in public administration and which are not. In other words, I wanted a method. I didn't want to just pick a list of names. And so I used factor analysis to see which journals loaded on public administration. So we ended up with quite a long list of journals that probably some of which might look a little bit outside. So we have a list of, and it's in the article, of journals that we considered, not just our own opinion, but they were statistically related. So that list then was used to create this.
Oh, I have this
Oh, that's
list.
it.
This is the
Yes.
list?
Oh, that's part
These
of
are
the
the
list,
journals.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So then we used that list, and so I took that list, I loaded it into the database, I said, tell me all of the journals that are citing these journals, referencing these journals.
Yeah, that answer your question?
Yeah, I also was wondering so one of the arguments to be made is that more people are citing us now than they were before.
Yes.
But in order to see that, you'd want to see this same map over time, right? Like,
Yes.
what did this look like?
You can do that.
Yeah.
I couldn't do it for this.
For
These are
sure,
all
yeah.
static.
Yeah.
And also, these are two-dimensional, when really it's a three-dimensional shape. So that's
Yeah.
also hard to see on just a flat screen. But if you are interested in this, I can show you how to do it. And what's really fun is when you get an interactive map going, like I could just touch public administration and it'll just light up the journal citing part. And then you can go to the external journals and see which are citing the external journals. It's fun. It's fun stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question about this mapping, and if you had an interest of doing it based on the scholar's disciplinary background. So is it that our scholars in public affairs and public policy are citing public affairs canon in these journals? Or is it that other scholars are learning about our work and then bringing it to their
Yeah,
their
so that's a great
disciplines?
question. So, in fact, we don't look at the people so
Okay.
much. This is a little bit hard to understand, but like we're studying the knowledge system rather than individual people. But you can assume that underneath here are people from external, outside of public administration citing PA. In other words, they're reading our journals and citing our journals, even though they're like in nursing, let's say, or they're in environmental sciences.
But you could have somebody, I think to your point, that's a PA scholar that gets published in American Economic Review. And when they do that, they cite PA stuff.
Right.
And it
That's
could be
true.
that our scholars are doing a better job of publishing in outside
True.
places, and we're citing our own our
Our
stuff.
own. Yeah, absolutely right. That's true too.
That's what your point
Yeah,
is.
that was my point.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jill, I think.
That was actually
Oh, that
exactly what I
was
was
your
gonna say. Although I will say, Caroline's offered to teach you how to do this. You did this for me like 10 years ago. And I learned enough to map some of the kind of alternative food policy field. And the piece was published in World Studies, which is
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to teach people. I mean, I absolutely love this stuff. So, and because I think it's so fascinating, but that's just me, you know. Yeah.
Thank you for your very interesting and beautiful presentation. I'm curious, based on this knowledge of the history and evolution of public administration, what do you think is the next steps, and what do you think is the future of the field, and relatedly, whether you are adjusting your editorship at par based on that knowledge?
Good question.
He's going to contradict
Go for it.
himself now because he said that you can't predict anything.
Good one.
Thank you, Russell.
Set
I
that
don't-
one up. He set that one up.
I don't know. And at the moment, we get there are so many submissions on so many different things that at the moment, I see a lot of trees and I don't see a forest. With this article, we could step away and look at a forest, right? I haven't done that for submissions so far, but you see a number of topics that emerge as getting a lot of attention. It could be because it's fashionable. Think about administrative burden. There was no such literature on administrative burden 20 years ago. Now it's a big deal. Behavioral PA is a big deal. It even has its own journal. 10 years ago, it wasn't there. There is an article coming out by Catherine Huntao and myself on the next steps of research in public administration, which will be in public performance management, something. PPMR, is that it? Review? Something like that. I have to ask Kai Feng where that is now. But, so I don't have it by heart, but
What do you think?
the balancing act between PA applied and PA theory will always be a challenge. Why? Because we get submissions that are purely conceptual and or theoretical, with a lot of empirical evidence provided to substantiate the argument made or the answer given, right? Now, we wanted more conceptual pieces, and that is where I was thinking back then when Catherine and I started to put together our proposal, more conceptual pieces on the role and position of government in society, the way people wrote about it 400 years ago. And that is as relevant today as it is back then. Is government too big? Is it too small, right? We also want specific attention for, through practically speaking, for applied pieces. Because we can try and become a true discipline without any regard for the outside world. But I don't know who remembers the criticism that political science experienced in the early 2000s about it being completely obtuse and coming up with theories and conceptualizations that were completely irrelevant to the real world of politics. PA cannot and should not be like that. So that is something in the back of my mind when I look at submissions. Now, that's not a complete answer, but I can send you the draft article if you want.
What do you think?
Well, I'm seeing a lot of new things in terms of methods. For example, I've definitely seen more inclusion in terms of methods. Like just 5 or 10 years ago, it would be very difficult to publish solely qualitative research in a top journal in our field, but I've seen more great qualitative research in the field. In our journals, I've seen some new topics like Esra paper on AI. This is an example of a new topic in terms of theory.
Definitely.
Yeah, in terms of theory, I'm not so sure.
No, we're-
Administrative burden was probably the most recent.
We're flooded with AI pieces, and now we're going to add next month an associate editor, Madalena Busovic from the University of Amsterdam, who has published on that and also in PAR. We need that because it's just a volume that, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
That's kind of where I was going to take it. The gatekeeper role of the editors of these journals and their choice of peer reviewers, how frequently you go outside of the field for peer reviewers, because regardless of what's in the reference list when first submitted, the peer review process is going to extend that.
Yeah.
And whether it extends it to take you out to these other journals or keep you within. I mean, again, just kind of watching the process. So I think there's several things with that. The gatekeeper role, how interdisciplinary are the PA journal editors, and how diverse are their editorial boards or peer reviewers?
No, but this is really a fascinating question.
You don't know that. I mean,
No, but you can actually see that if you look at editorials. Other people have studied it, right, to look at editorial boards. Fewer women on the more elite boards, by the way. But if you look at the most elite journals, they're extremely disciplined. They're very, very disciplined. And that is because they keep the canon. And so they're going to be less likely to go out to different people. And therefore, they're going to be more, ultimately, they become much more what I would call ossified, right? Because they keep a sort of core area, core field. And then the journals on the outside, right, they're taking a risk, right? They take a risk because they're going to go outside of their field. And as I said, then 90% of the stuff is just junk or not, it's not really good scholarship. But then every once in a while, they really hit, right? And so the hit rate is low, but the impact is great. See what I mean? If you have a really great piece. Like,
Yeah, one of the things we struggle with at JPAM is, so if you look at our impact factor, it's actually lower than PAR. Part of it is that a lot of our JPAM articles aren't citing other JPAM articles. So they're citing economics or political science or sociology, and actually when we select reviewers, we intentionally pick people with those expertise in those other fields, but that actually hurts our ability to grow our impact factor. But we've actually talked about this as an editorial board, and we're like, we don't care. Like, we actually would rather that research be like good research, and rather than, but it does hurt us in some ways, because you're not, like, the nice thing about JPAR and PAR and PPMR, they're building up, and JPAM isn't. And because you've got an article on education policy next to an article on water quality, next to an article on, and they're all citing the things in their own fields. They're not citing each other. Why would they? Education's, you know what I mean?
Right.
And so it ends up not becoming, it doesn't become as,
diffuses.
yeah, so it's a trade-off in some ways. I don't know, yeah.
Well, it will be a topic that I now have noted for an associate editor meeting that we're going to do early October. Say that now, I don't have a date yet, but you hear. But when I look at the reviewers, because we have at the moment 15, soon 16 associate editors, right? So that means that the web we can spread, so to speak, between Catherine, Hongtao, and myself is far wider, because Jill is one of our associate editors with the focus, among other things, on food policy, and there was something else. Qualitative methods, that's right. So she can tap into people that are not so familiar to me. And we have one for emergency and disaster management stuff. That's a literature where I know some people, but I don't know the whole batch. So through that, associate editors can reach out to a far larger batch of reviewers than the three of us could do on our own. But I'm going to bring it up because it's an interesting point of discussion.
All right, Russell.
I don't have a question, but I think a comment or an observation. I think it's probably related to what Neil was asking as well as what Long was asking. What I'm now seeing, 20 years ago when I started this, right, how things were versus how it is now. We're also seeing PA scholars venturing out and trying to sort of publish in other journals in other fields, right? And at the same time, we are also seeing people from other fields, those journals, they are coming to some PA scholars to review their work. So that was not happening 20 years ago at all. It was very much insular. I think that has changed quite a bit in the last 20 years.
I think that supports our
Yeah.
study.
Yeah, yeah.
Who else has, yeah, Ron.
Beyond publications, I'm curious about hiring decisions within schools or colleges of public administration. Who they're hiring, and how does that help define the field? Are they hiring their own, or do they continue to hire outside?
I mentioned that I was hired at the University of Leiden, right, as a researcher. I was the 5th faculty person there. So I was the historian. We had a linguist, we had an economist, we had a sociologist, and we had a lawyer. And that group of people, I was just additional at that point, because for 2 years I had to focus on that research project. But that group of people designed a curriculum. And it was from the onset intentionally interdisciplinary. And that we did together with the University of Rotterdam, the PA section, and later then there.
There are people that study that, so I'll see if I can find them.
And if you think about the makeup here, how would you describe your background, Russell?
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know why also was when I got my PhD. So that
Well,
was even
yeah, but-
something about.
Yeah, well, Jill has a background. David studied. So this is in itself already an interdisciplinary faculty. And that's a good thing, I think. Or I find, yes.
I have a question, maybe for you, Caroline. Thinking about how do we identify the public impact of our research? So it's different than journal citations. Has anybody, so like Rand or Urban or Brookings or those types of reports, I think it would actually be interesting to see how often our research is being cited by those reports. And is there a way to do a web with non-indexed? I mean, those aren't indexed publications, but like I actually do think it's cool if Rand has cited something one of our scholars has written, or if another think tank has.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's any movement to try to
Yeah,
map
that's a really good
think tank
question.
citing.
I mean, Rand doesn't cite things. as we
Okay,
noticed.
okay,
You read
okay.
their, you read their, they don't tend not to
Okay,
cite. I mean,
okay.
rather rare for them to cite.
Interesting,
right?
okay.
But Rand asked the question, not do we get cited?
Do they get
They
cited?
ask how much impact have we had on policy?
Mhm.
So that's how they judge their effectiveness.
And how do they measure that?
Well, they look at changes in public policy. So they look at, who implemented our ideas, who developed our, the programs that are, that we've recommended and that kind of thing. So, yeah. Yeah, Jill.
How much does the availability of journals through libraries impact I guess, let me back up. Has there been a change, for instance, like PAR? Was PAR offered through like 100 libraries, and then in 2003, 1,000 libraries? Because you're more likely going to cite things you have access to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so like PPMG, for example, like I don't think our library had access to PPMG. I don't know if it does now, but I know a couple of years ago it didn't, and it was like frustrating. And so it's like, well, could I find something else to cite, or, so I don't know, like library holdings, does that impact citations?
Yeah. No, it's totally,
Yeah.
totally great comment.
Great question.
Yeah.
So I don't know if they're sold as like a package, like,
They are sold as packages.
Because something happened in your picture. Like what happened?
What
Was that open source? Like what was it?
What happened is
not the
Google
same thing
Scholar was
as me.
invented in around 2003.
Oh.
So, yeah, and so I think that,
Google Scholar was invented, he just said, that could explain this.
yeah, that definitely.
It's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's Google, I think it's Google Scholar, but I haven't studied that, but I mean, it's the access question that you're absolutely right. Now people have access to much more than they used to. And I mean, actually, that's a great thing. And what they found, people, not me, but the other people have studied this and seen that people are now citing much older work. than they used to. It used to be they'd cite more recent work. Now they're going back historically and citing much more historical work, which I think is really fascinating.
I do have a question. So I don't see JPAR listed there. So JPAR is not citing PAR?
So JPART has a problem in that it's not listed in SSCI, or it's not listed in the SCI, I think it is. So I think that's why you're not seeing it.
SCI, what is that?
Oh, sorry,
Social
science,
science.
science citation.
It's in that, for sure.
It's
JPAR
in
is there.
SSCI, and I think I just drew from SCI in this.
Oh.
Oh, just the science?
Sorry, it's just a database issue. I can,
But it's in the other figures, Jay.
I can also find that. All right, who has other thoughts? Doctoral students are quiet over
Yeah,
there.
come on, doc students.
Where do you think the field is going?
You guys are on the.
That's
Yeah, that's
putting
what
on
it
the
is.
spot. I couldn't have
There's
answered
the
that.
future.
I couldn't have answered that 40 years ago.
I know.
I still find it difficult.
I feel like it's really hard because we have such like a narrow, like, we just have like a slice of like what's going on right now. Like, I mean, I wasn't, I was in the field like that long ago, but I feel like I agree with like Long's assessment that there does seem to be a greater like methodological pluralism in the field, which I think is really interesting as a student. Like, I feel like I'm exposed to like a buffet of like, oh, I can study this, I can study this, I can study this in terms of methods, which I think is really useful. I think that's been really exciting to me. And I think it's like interesting to hear that like not that long ago that wasn't the case. So I feel excited to see what happens with that.
Well, and another element to add to that is that there was a panel last year or 2 years ago at ASPA that I attended where people complained about the fact that in PA journals there are fewer and fewer case studies. So we have our eyes open in PAR for case studies. Yeah, because they can be extremely illustrative. You may not be able to generalize immediately, but case studies are useful.
Okay.
Yeah.
There was another comment over there. Yeah.
Yeah, this idea is maybe a little still kind of nascent, so feel free to probe it. But one thing that I'm exploring this semester with Dr. Clark is when you look at engaged research, the output of an academic paper is certainly valuable in an academic setting, but for the people that you're doing engaged research with, the paper may not be the most relevant output. And so what are some of the other outputs that may have more of an impact on what you were saying with RAND looking at like impacts on public policy or actual changes in society. And so I'm curious about how that fits in with PAB's own academic area of study.
I have to think a little.
I have to think too. I think like a RAND kind of function is a translational function in a knowledge system, let's say. So most academic papers are not read by policymakers, right? So policymakers, and even when we had the former Secretary of Defense come to RAND, and somebody asked him, Rumsfeld, and we said, which RAND study was the most impactful that you read? And he said, I didn't read any studies. Right. So he doesn't read studies. So people at some level read studies. And so if you think about it that way, right, a RAND is translating the knowledge that's coming out of academic life, and they're going to read, certain articles. They're going to go to the more elite journals, sadly enough. Sorry. No. Because they're going to miss the things at the edges. But then within the academic world, right, we're supposed to be looking even to the edges. Like, where are the really interesting themes? And that's where the question of disciplinarity and interdisciplinarity come into play. Because in order to be truly interdisciplinary, you have to have a deep disciplinarity. Does that make sense? So in other words, you have to have strength in a discipline so that you're surprised by something new. And that's where, if you look at the history of knowledge creation, right, you won't necessarily recognize the new unless you know the discipline extremely well. Like, how would you know that electron's not supposed to be there when you do the blowing of electrons? Well, you would have to know them really, really well. And it's the same thing in any field. So you have to know that discipline really well. So I think our job as academics, right, is to know our field, read broadly, look for the novel, and try to understand when something novel is meaningful, right? Because there's all kinds of novelty, but most of it's not useful or meaningful. And so our job is to find that and bring that to attention so that the people at a RAND level, let's say, will read that, will read the important, the novel that's worth paying attention to.
Okay, and I want to add to that, because I think that's nice. When I was the managing editor of PAR, I had a submission in 2010 by a Canadian scholar who had investigated in the province of Quebec how many articles in their professional field of study these career civil servants read. And the answer was less than 2% of the career civil servants with an academic degree, bachelor's or higher, in the province of Quebec read articles published in professional journals of their study. They have no time. So what we're going to do in PAR now, gosh, I'm marketing this thing. We're going to do PAR is for articles of which we feel that some commentary is useful, and I have an illustration of that, you know what I'm talking about, is useful to practitioners, the way that the discovery that the lineup for police to recognize the face of the person who violated you or something, right, doesn't work. And it took years before police departments finally recognized that you have to do the lineup sequentially. So that there's time in between seeing faces rather than seeing next to one another and take the closest pick. So that was a few decades before that finally had trickled in. And I know police departments still don't have it. What we're going to do for articles that have been accepted, we look at them. Is there something in that article that is of immediate relevance to practitioners, to career civil service? What we're going to do is ask the author to write a one-page summary with an eye on practitioners. The way that Russell and I did for an article in PAR in 2019, out of work that you had done with the Highway Patrol and then other agencies, that article I summarized in an article for, what was the professional journal's title? Sheriffs, something with sheriffs.
Police executive or something.
Or police chiefs or something like that. A one-pager that summarized why is this relevant to you, police person, because they're not going to read PAR.
Let me just jump on
Yeah.
that. That's called a policy brief usually, right? Yeah. In order to write a really good policy brief, you have to understand policy, right? Because the ideas that we might think of as very interesting aren't necessarily going to be actionable for a policymaker. So
To talk to the policymakers.
well, that's it. So the way that we, as a field, stay relevant is working with policymakers, right? Like David does with his capstone classes, like working with people out in the field. So that's what makes our field distinct, right? Because we are in between, right? In between the practice and the theory. And so understand, because the theory, of course, is interesting to us because we're academics, we love that. But in order to take that, I mean, an academic like Rumsfeld wouldn't care one bit about a theory.
Academics like Rumsfeld.
No, sorry, I meant the other way. Practitioners like Rumsfeld doesn't care at all about theory. So in order to get there, right, and we do want to have an impact on policy, but we have to understand that side of it. And so sometimes that, especially for newer people coming into the field, that takes effort and discussion, right, and learning, right? You have to work with people who have actually been in the field in order to understand, like, how will they absorb this information? How do they, what is their level of information intake and capacity to absorb it?
Okay, we're over time.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you, everybody.